final lecture video for Chapter 3, Interdependence and the Gains from Trade. We've been walking through the chapter. We've introduced ourselves to Frank and Ruby. They're living on the frontier. They make two things, meat and potatoes. At first, they were not trading, and we knew what they were consuming, what they produced, what they consumed. And Ruby had a bright idea of, hey, let's start trading and maybe we can make more. And that was in video 1. Video 2, we established that actually trade does make them better off, but we have no idea up until now, how did Ruby know this? What was she considering? She had absolute advantage. Shouldn't she produce everything? Maybe should they trade? Why should they trade? It all comes down to something called comparative advantage. So we are working on Chapter 3, Table 1, and we're looking at comparative advantage, which is the ability to produce a good at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. Well, what's an opportunity cost? Emphasis here on cost, because eventually we want the lower number, not the higher number. Everybody thinks productivity, we want the higher number. So you have to train yourself. Cost, you always want the lower number. What is opportunity cost? If you recall from Chapter 1 when we looked at opportunity cost, it was the cost of what you get to what you give up. So if you want to produce meat, you're giving up time producing potatoes. If you want to produce potatoes, you're giving up time producing meat. Just like if you're watching this lecture, you're giving up some time to watch Netflix, or if you're taking an economics class, you're giving up time to take an English class or whatever. Man, the book has a great narrative that a lot of students skip right over, and they jump right to Table 1, and they're like, hey, okay, the opportunity cost of 1 ounce for meat for Frank is 4 ounces, and 1/4 ounces of meat to produce potatoes. But then you have no clue where that number came from because you skipped the reading. Remember, in this class, no shortcuts. You want to fail this class? Start taking shortcuts. I have an idea. It's my little thought bubble. Remember Figure 1, all the way back in video number 1 of this chapter? We deduced what they could produce. We started out with what they could produce per minute, and then we deduced what they could produce in 8 hours. Now in the reading, the book takes you through the logic of how Frank and Ruby can produce per minute. So I wanted to alternatively, in this video, take you through the logic of, okay, what do they produce in 8 hours? Well, if you recall from Table 1, or excuse me, Figure 1, this is Table 1. Figure 1, Frank, if he spent all 8 hours, he could produce 8 ounces of meat because he was 1 ounce per hour, 60 minutes to make an ounce. And then if you produce all potatoes, he can make 32 ounces. Now, in the end, in trade, Ruby actually has him concentrate on producing potatoes, and we'll talk about why here in a second. So if he went all 8 hours here, he'd be 32 ounces of potatoes. Ruby, conversely, if she went all 8 hours on meat, she'd make 24 ounces of potatoes. Because she can make 3 ounces per hour. She had absolute advantage over Frank, who could only make 1 ounce per hour. Ruby's just a powerhouse. She can make 24 ounces if all she did was meat. Potatoes, conversely, she could do 48 ounces of potatoes in an 8-hour day. That means she could do 6 ounces per hour. So it was like every 10 minutes she could do an ounce. So 6 ounces per hour, 8 hours, 48 ounces. And that was like their maximum producing of meat and potatoes. We know they ended up, without trade, kind of going 4 and 4, 4 hours producing potatoes, 4 hours producing meat, and they satisficed essentially. Then Ruby has the great idea to trade. How does she make that decision as to who could do what? Because, you know, honestly, if you look at it for absolute advantage, she had absolute advantage in everything. There's a trick here, and I'm gonna jump straight to the trick. Here's my tip. To get your opportunity cost, again, the cost of what you get, let's say meat, is the cost of what you give up, let's say potatoes. So to produce meat, you gotta give up potatoes. Why don't you take what you are producing? Okay, write this down. Take what you are producing and divide it into what you are not producing. Doesn't that then divide up what you're giving up for what you're getting to bring in? So the cost of what you get is what you give up. So the cost of getting meat is giving up potatoes. So you can take their productivity. This is, you know, Frank and Ruby. It could be France and Spain. Okay? It could be the United States and Mexico. The cost of what you get is what you give up. Take what you are producing and divide it into what you are not producing, and that tells you what you're giving up. So for example, when Frank produces meat, he's not producing potatoes. So to produce meat, let's say all out, he goes 8 hours in 8 ounces of meat. he gives up 8 hours of potatoes, which is 32 ounces of potatoes. Take what you are producing, 8 ounces, and divide it into what you are not producing, 32 ounces. 8 into 32 is 4. Or you could do it as a fraction and put 32 in the numerator, 8 in the denominator. 8 into 32 is 4. Well, guess what? That's where this number came from. Okay? To make 1 ounce of meat. Now, we did all in on the 8 ounces, but per ounce, if you divide it into, that's per ounce. To make 1 ounce of meat, he gives up 4 ounces of potatoes. Okay? So the cost of what you get is what you give up. So this is 4 ounces of potatoes. All right? Let's do the same thing with Ruby in producing meat. When Ruby produces meat, she's not producing potatoes. So take what you are producing and divide it into what you are not producing. 24 to 48 is 2. Another way to express this, I did this more or less for your own edification to see how the process works. What I'd really prefer is that you do fractions because these numbers won't always be so round. So when you do this, you take 24, what you are producing, divide it into what you are not producing, 48, and you get 2 ounces of potatoes. Okay? Look at that. When Ruby's producing meat, she gives up 2 ounces of potatoes. That's how we got it. All right? The book walks you through by per minute. I'm walking you through by the 8-hour day. Either way works. Okay? Now, I could repeat this 2 more times, but can I just take the reciprocal? So to calculate this for producing potatoes instead of meat, so you're producing potatoes and not meat, the cost of what you get is what you give up, opportunity cost. To produce potatoes, you're giving up meat. Aren't we just flipping this around? So it was 32 over 8 here. The reciprocal would be if I could speak English, would then be 32 into 8. Because you are producing potatoes and you're not producing meat, it's 8 over 32, which is 1/4. But if you're producing potatoes, what are you giving up? Ounces of meat. So the opportunity cost there of producing 1 ounce of potatoes is 1/4 ounce of meat. Same thing with Ruby here. Ruby, before we were producing meat and not potatoes, it was 24 into 48. Well, here it's 48 into 24. Get 1/2. 1/2 of what? Well, you're producing potatoes, so what you're giving up is meat. So 1/2 ounce of meat. Okay? So this is how these numbers came about. Now, 2 things here. Comparative advantage is how you determine who should trade what. But again, when we're looking at comparative advantage, we're not talking about productivity, we're talking about cost. We're talking opportunity cost. So when you think about cost, do you want to maximize cost or minimize cost? You want to minimize costs. You absolutely want to minimize costs. So the temptation is to come in here and say, you know what, Frank does better at making meat, let's go with him. No, these are costs. These are costs. You got to remember that. These are costs. You want to go with the lower costs. So, when I'm considering giving the opportunity cost, who has comparative advantage in producing meat, it needs to be the lower number. And that's right here. 2 is less than 4. Ruby has a comparative advantage in producing meat. Wait, tell me again, what did Ruby specialize in? Meat. Okay? Now, half is better than 1/4. Let's go half. That's the trick you fall into. Everybody screws up on the test and the homework. It's cost. You want to go with the lower. 1/4 is less than 1/2. Uh-oh, here we go. Who has a lower opportunity cost to make potatoes? Frank. My man Frank finally has something. He has a comparative advantage in making potatoes. All right? He can do it at a lower cost. He's not as productive in producing meat. We found that out when we talked about Ruby having a comparative advantage. But he is more efficient at producing meat. Or excuse me, I said that wrong. He is more efficient at producing potatoes. He's not all that great at producing meat. Remember, Ruby beat him like 3-1 on meat. She had absolute advantage. But he is efficient. He gives up less meat to produce potatoes. Okay? So a point of clarification here. When you're talking about cost, always go with the lower. This is how we know Frank should specialize in potatoes. Alright, and Ruby should specialize in meat. Comparative advantage. It's all about who gives up less to produce something. All right, now, it's a lot of back and forth, right? It's just meat and potatoes. It should be a simple chapter. It's only chapter 3. If you're trying to do this in your head, I have a PhD in this stuff. When you're doing this homework, all right, you need to have a piece of scratch paper. This board made it a little more simple. It's a little more complicated to you because it's the first time you're ever doing it. But I have scratch paper every time I do these problems. And again, I'm terminally degreed in this area. So don't think you can do this without having some scratch paper with you on the homework, on the test, whatever. You need to be able to write this out, okay? Because like, hey, man, let me keep it straight. I'm making meat or am I making potatoes? If I'm making potatoes, am I giving up meat? I'm making meat, I'm giving up potatoes. You better write that down or you're going to get yourself all twisted inside your own head. So, how Table 1 came about is given in the narrative and the reading. They do it by minutes. I did it by the whole production of the day. How did I do that? The tip is take what you are producing, divide it into what you are not. And the cost of producing meat is potatoes. The cost of producing potatoes is meat. All right, so you express it in that way. Take what you are producing, divide it into what you are not. Take what you are producing and divide it into what you are not. Flip the other side, the reciprocal, 32 into 8, 48 into 24. You get 1/4 and 1/2. So if you've gotten this far, it's a doggone Greek tragedy if you get this far and forget you're talking about costs and you want to give comparative advantage to the person with the lower cost, not the higher. This is not productivity. This is cost. So, comparative advantage Frank on potatoes, comparative advantage Ruby on meat, and that's why they produce what they produce. But you have got to be able to write this down. I have to write it down every time, and I've taught this for 5 years running, all right? 5 years running, and I still have to write it down. You do. You have to write it down. Let me know if you have any questions. Again, on cost, always go with the smaller number. Again, cost, smaller number. You're going revenues, you're going productivity, try to go with the bigger number. But absolute advantage, while it tells you who can produce what well, it doesn't tell you who produces what efficiently. It doesn't tell you who produces things at a lower cost. So you need to be concerned with comparative advantage when we're talking about trade. And in this case, and we've seen in videos 1, videos 2, and videos 3, trade makes everyone better off, including Frank and Ruby, when we're talking about meat and potatoes. Now, how do we relay this to real world? Well, Frank could be France, Ruby could be Spain, Frank could be US, Ruby could be Mexico, Frank could be California, and Ruby could be South Carolina. There are things that all of those things do better than the other place, and they have to sort those things out. Okay? This is kind of a metaphor for what happens in the larger sense in the economy. Trade can make everyone better off. Okay? Hope you've enjoyed the video. Let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to comment, ask questions or anything.